Guys, never play Polybius, and this is why.
If you were born before the 2000s, you might remember spending a lot of time and a lot of money at your local video arcade. In their heyday, arcades were where you had to go if you wanted to experience cutting-edge games, and new cabinets were being installed all the time. And in 1981, right around the birth of the arcade boom, one such cabinet would serve as the center of a conspiracy so strange and mysterious that it's still talked about 40 years later. That game was called Polybius. Polybius was first spotted in a few neighborhood video arcades around the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Children rushing to spend their pocket change on games of Pac-Man and Pong were surprised and excited to find that a new game had been quietly installed next to their old favorites. The cabinet wasn't like the others they had seen, though. It was solid black, with no decoration aside from the glowing text above the screen that read, Polybius, in a blocky white font. The game appeared to be a standard 2D shooter, similar to Asteroids, but the graphics were much better than anything else that had yet been released, and the technology used appeared to be far beyond the capabilities of other cabinets at the time, featuring both vector and raster graphics. The game was an instant hit anywhere it was installed, with lines to play it stretching around the block. It wasn't Polybius' groundbreaking graphics that would make it famous, though. Rumors soon began circulating that you would experience some truly weird stuff while playing it. Some players reported hearing a woman crying while they played the game. Others saw misshapen faces out of the corner of their eyes when they looked at the screen. After playing, players would often report a sense of missing time, being unable to remember how they got there or how long they'd been playing. That could easily be explained away as the effect of too much screen time. But unlike with other games of the time that people were also playing for hours and hours, the effects went beyond simple mental fatigue. It was when those who had played Polybius left the arcade and went home that the real terror started. Players who had spent extended periods on the Polybius cabinet experienced night terrors, anxiety attacks, dizziness, and extreme nausea, and it seemed that the longer and more frequently one played the game, the worse the mental effects would become. Strangely, the reports of the game's side effects did nothing to lessen its popularity, even among those who were plagued by the game's effects. The game seemed to be addictive, and would put its players into almost a trance-like state during gameplay. But the strangest of all reports to surface regarding the game Polybius was that later at night, after the arcades had closed, people reported seeing strange men in black suits enter the arcade. Some even claimed that they had peeked inside while the men in suits were there, and saw them extracting data from the back of the Polybius cabinets. These men wouldn't answer questions about what they were doing there, or even speak to anyone at all, including the arcade owners. The men would simply barge their way in, open up the back of the Polybius cabinet, and switch out the game's ROM before taking the original away with them. Nobody could be sure who these men were, or why they were collecting data from Polybius and not any of the other games. Were they simply pulling data that had to do with gameplay in order to improve the game and make it even more addictive for players? Or was there something even more sinister going on with this strange game? Before any answers could be found about the mysterious game, the company behind it, or the men in black suits, all of the cabinets suddenly vanished from arcades. Most reports claimed that Polybius was only available to play for a month in the summer of 1981, and after appearing seemingly out of nowhere, disappeared just as quickly as they'd shown up. According to some Portland residents who claimed to be present when the Polybius machines were dismantled and removed from arcades, the machines had one last strange quality. They said that the screen remained on even after the cabinet had been unplugged and carted away, and that was the last time Polybius was seen in the wild. There are reports of people seeing the cabinets again in 1998, but no definitive proof of these sightings exists. The game has never resurfaced, and although many have made attempts to recreate it, none of the replicas ever had the same bizarre effects on players that the original game had. So, what exactly was Polybius? One of the most ascribed to theories is that it wasn't a game at all, but actually a government psyops experiment, similar to MKUltra, a top-secret project conducted by the CIA in the 1960s, which involved using a mix of torture, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, controlled electroshocks, and psychoactive drugs in order to test the limits of the human mind. The project was started in response to allegations that the Chinese and Soviet armies were using hypnosis to control American prisoners of war in Korea. Never one to be outdone, the CIA wanted to see if they could produce the conditions necessary to completely control a subject's mind, and in further tests, totally erase a person's memory. The tests were brutal, and often conducted on completely unwilling and unaware subjects, something that can sadly be said of many CIA experiments carried out during the Cold War. Given their track record, it's not hard to believe that, in 1981, still firmly within the Cold War period, that the US government would be willing to test a powerful psychic weapon on unsuspecting American children. in the form of an arcade game. The theory that Polybius game cabinets were really government mind control machines was only bolstered further by the game's creator. On the game start screen, the text read, Polybius, copyright 1981, Sinnesloschen. The name Sinnesloschen is derived from the German words meaning senses and to delete or to extinguish. The most common interpretation of the name is sensory deletion or sensory deprivation, both of which are appropriate ways to describe the missing time and amnesia that would often happen following intense Polybius play sessions. Despite the strangeness of the Polybius story, the game appears to have been completely ignored by the media at the time of its release. No gaming magazines at the time reported on the game's release, and no mainstream news outlets covered the effects it supposedly had on children. Whether this complete blackout of information regarding the game was intentional or not is unknown. The legend of Polybius didn't really get off the ground until it started circling among Usenet posters in the early 90s. One of the earliest still surviving posts about Polybius was made in 2000 on the arcade gaming site coinup.org. The poster claimed to have found an original ROM, from which they were able to extract some damaged fragments of text, including the copyright 1981 Sinnesloschen. The rest of the game's entry on coinup.org was sparse, with no description of gameplay, and most of the page was dedicated to archiving the rumors surrounding the game's addictive nature and psychoactive effects. Kurt Kohler, the administrator of coinup.org, was intrigued by the entry and forwarded it to the editors of GamePro, a gaming magazine that was popular at the time. In 2003, GamePro published a piece exploring the legend of Polybius for a mainstream audience. The article called the stories and rumors inconclusive, leaving the story open-ended, as the writers were unable to confirm any of the story that Kurt had sent them. However, after the issue of GamePro containing the Polybius story was released, people began coming forward to share their own Polybius stories. One of the most notable was a man named Stephen Roach, a Czech Republic-based game developer, who in 2006 claimed he had been one of the original programmers who worked on Polybius. According to Stephen, it wasn't a government psyop, just a normal video game, albeit one with graphics that were far ahead of their time. In interviews, Stephen gave details on the gameplay of Polybius. The game centered around a moon base, largely plagiarized from Star Wars, which displayed a number. There were 6 sets of different aliens. The first, which varied through 6 levels, appeared as random waves sent out from the moon base which needed to be destroyed. The others were numbered between 1 and 10, which had to be repelled back into the base to lower the total. The figure had to match exactly to clear the level. According to him, the graphics were very intense for the time, and the gameplay became increasingly frantic as the game went on. The visuals were so intense that it caused at least one child to have a seizure, which was the reason for the game's removal from arcades. From there, the legend built and became more dramatic over time, leading to the more well-known story of Men in Black and government mind control. But Stephen Roach's story isn't the end of the Polybius mystery. Even though he's given multiple interviews on the subject, there's no concrete proof that he ever worked on Polybius. The name does not exist in U.S. copyright records, nor does any company called Sinnesloschen. In fact, the word itself, Sinnesloschen, isn't even a real German word. It's a made-up compound word, the kind that an English speaker might incorrectly put together using a German dictionary. One other explanation exists for the true name of Polybius. In the late 70s and early 80s, video arcades were a popular front for organized crime, and it wasn't uncommon for arcade games to be modified in order to be used for gambling. In response to this trend, the FBI would sometimes send agents into arcades to interview customers and check the machines for tampering and irregularities. Agents who were famous for their black suits and stony dispositions. That on its own would have been a sinister sight for young kids going to the arcade. But there was another video game-related scandal at the time that further fueled the fire of the Polybius legend. The game Berserk was released in 1980 and is known for both being the first game to utilize voice synthesis and being the first game to definitely actually kill somebody. In 1982, 18-year-old Peter Bukowski suffered a fatal heart attack mere minutes after beating the high score for Berserk at Friar Tuck's game room in Calumet City, Illinois. The coroner's report concluded that the stress of his marathon gaming session and his excitement upon winning the high score exacerbated pre-existing damage to his heart and resulted in his sudden death. Since 1982, at least 2 more deaths by heart attack have been linked to playing Berserk. Considering these 2 events, the deaths of Berserk players and the presence of G-men in arcades, it's easy to see how someone who was a child in the 1980s could 20 years later, while posting on Usenet, conflate these memories into a single story about a killer game being monitored by the government. It would seem that that's the mystery of Polybius solved, and pretty conclusively at that. However, there's still one part of the story that can't be explained. The picture of a Polybius cabinet that was included on the first coinup.org post about the game. It's impossible to prove what year the picture was taken, but it still makes you think. If Polybius really was a government experiment, wouldn't the best way to cover it up be to make the whole thing seem like it was just another urban legend?
So guys, do me a favor and